to be under the sea. In an octopus's garden with you.
And Nyrie Palmer joins us to talk about bubbles and what's happening under the water this weekend. Tell us about what's happening, Nyrie. Good morning.
Good morning. One really interesting thing to observe while scuba diving, other than sea creatures and good rocks, are bubbles. When you're diving, you can breathe out and watch a stream of bubbles drift upwards to the surface. It keeps me entertained during safety stops, and the physics is really interesting.
That's interesting.
And the bubbles float because the air has a lower density than the surrounding water. There's no soap involved in these bubbles, though. They're held together with surface tension, and the water molecules bind together to create a boundary between the water and the air. And that surface tension is pretty firm, so some bubbles actually reach the surface before they break apart.
What determines the size of the bubbles?
The size of the bubbles depends on the amount of water that's pushing against the bubble that compresses the air inside. So really, the size of the bubble largely depends on the depth. So when the bubbles rise, there's less water compressing the bubbles, so the bubble gets bigger. And you can watch them while diving. The bubbles get bigger and wider as they reach the surface.
I love this. You're meant to be looking for fish, aren't you, and other interesting corals, other interesting life down there, and you're just down there daydreaming with your bubbles.
At safety stops, when you're coming to the surface, you have to spend 3 minutes at 5 metres, and if the visibility is poor, there's not much to do, so bubbles are really interesting.
If I'm looking for you, if I'm up above on a boat and I'm like, where's Nyrie? Can I see your bubbles popping up on the surface?
You can actually look across the water and often spot the trail of bubbles. You can work out where the divers are. And if you're a diver and don't want people on the surface to know that you're there, you can blow smaller bubbles and breathe more slowly so you're less detectable. Marco knows about this.
Interesting. And what about the shape of the bubbles?
You might imagine that bubbles underwater are spheres, just as they are in air. And at first this is the case because there's a tendency for the bubble to minimise the surface tension in its swirl. But there are different forces at play underwater. When a bubble rises, the water above pushes down on it, flattening its top into a dome. But they're not hemispheres or teardrop shapes like raindrops either. When the water moves around the flattened bubble, it circles back behind it and creates an indent underneath. So the bubbles actually look like silver jellyfish rising to the surface, a dome on the top and an indent underneath. And that isn't a coincidence. The concave dome is an incredibly energy-efficient shape moving through the water. And sometimes the indent underneath the bubble breaks through the top and it creates a ring. And some divers can make bubble rings with their mouths like smoke rings, and some use their hands to create bubble rings. And although I've spent a lot of time practicing, I haven't even come close to making a bubble ring as a special talent.
You mentioned that bubbles are silver. Do we know why this is?
Yeah, the bubbles are actually reflective because the surface tension creates that environment. It reflects the light. And it also refracts light so that sometimes the bubbles have a rainbow hue.
Are they helpful at all? What are bubbles? What's the purpose of them?
Yeah, well, not only are bubbles interesting, they can also help you when you're disorientated. They can help you work out which way is up and which way is to the surface. And bubbles can tell you where there's current because the bubbles will also trail off in this direction that the water's flowing. But bubbles are also handy for scaring off sharks. If a shark comes too close to you, you yell out through your regulator, and a stream of bubbles cascade from your mouth and it spooks them. But divers actually want to see sharks, so we stay close to the walls so the bubbles travel up the cliff. Otherwise, the bubbles create a silver curtain in front of the shark and it scares them off. The other important thing about bubbles when you're diving is that you have to blow bubbles continually. This is because if you hold your breath and rise in the water, the air expands like the bubbles expand, and this can really injure your lungs. And that's why it's super important during emergency ascents to keep breathing out the whole time. So bubbles are a good thing.
Are bubbles ever not a good thing?
It's true that bubbles are not always a diver's friend, as they cause the bends. When your body is under pressure when diving, nitrogen can build up in your bloodstream. And if you rise too quickly, the pressure on your body releases rapidly and the nitrogen in your blood turns into bubbles. It's just like taking the lid off a Coke bottle. At first the Coke is under pressure, but when you release the pressure quickly, all the bubbles form, and you don't want that happening with the nitrogen in your blood. And speaking of Coke, drinking bubbly drinks before a dive is also a bad idea. When you rise, the air in your stomach expands and you become a burp machine. It's like the fizzy lifting drink of Willy Wonka.
Now, Nyrie, you're being a bit of a hero today, getting up and chatting to us on the radio, because you're not even going diving. You're a bit under the weather, so you're not under the water this weekend. So thank you. What a legend you are for joining us.
I'm not feeling well.
So
but,
what are the conditions like for those who are out and
about? It's going to
about?
be so great today. Yesterday, the viz was about 8 metres, but today there's a rough surge from the south-southeast at 2.6 metres with a period of 7 seconds. So the viz will be lower, but hopefully the deeper depths will be better. I can't go on the reef survey today that I had planned. I'll be staying dry, and I'll be getting all my bubbles from my soda stream.
Well, I hope you enjoy it, and I'm not going to look at bubbles in the same way ever again. How fascinating. You obviously have pondered them at great length. I can tell that you've been a special project of yours.
For at least 3 minutes every dive.
Thanks so much, Nyrie. Lovely to have you along as always. I hope you feel better soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nyrie Palmer there. She is from the Sydney Underwater Gazette with our diving report.